Okay, Charles, if you would please, let's read Galatians 4, verse 4, and this is our kind of our final element of between the testaments.
But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that He might redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons.
So now I've got the fullness of times. This is one of these instances where we can define the word, and the definition of the word is helpful, but it doesn't explain the concept, and the concept is the big thing. Why was Jesus born when He was born? So we're going to step through the fullness of times, and then we're going to talk about when Jesus was born, which we'll come back to in the discussion of the harmony of the Gospels just in a little while. But let's think about the whole concept of the fullness of times. And I want to suggest to you that we've got contributions by three different sets of people. So first of all, what did the Jews give us? When Jesus was born, then what does the contribution of the Jews come to? Well, first of all, synagogues in the diaspora. So what was the diaspora? Or diaspora? What was the diaspora? Diaspora is the Greek word for, we take now the English version of it, dispersion. So I brought up a map yesterday about how all of the Jews that were in Babylon were dispersed everywhere. So some of them came back to where? Some of them came back to Judea, but they got dispersed literally everywhere. Synagogues in the diaspora had spread the knowledge of the one true God among the Romans. That's the first element. Number two, belief in the coming of the Messiah produced an expectancy among the Jews at the time that Jesus came. They would then, of course, talk to other people about that. That would become a heightened sense of expectancy. And then finally, the Hebrew Scriptures provided the purest ethical system in existence, especially when compared to paganism and mythology. How long's paganism been around? How long's paganism been around? Since the beginning. Funny enough, though, mythology normally, especially if you're thinking about Jesus in the first century world, when you think about mythology, what mythology are you thinking about? Greek mythology, Greco-Roman mythology. How long had that been around? This is surprising. Not that long. About the time that the writing prophets started writing, Greco-Roman mythology began to take shape. So it's really not that old. 700, 800, maybe 1,000 years before the time of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, when Jesus comes along, it's heavily embedded in the society, but it just wasn't quite that old. Paganism in general was a lot older. Here's the contribution of the Jews. This is what they produced as far as the fullness of times is concerned. So moving on to the Greeks. Now what the Greeks gave was a universal diffusion of Greek culture and language. They excelled in most areas of course, human activity. What's really important, at least in my mind, was the diffusion of the language. So the language was so diffuse that everyone what? Everyone spoke it. So when all of the apostles, the main one would be Paul, just only because the scope of where he went was so large. But wherever Paul went, what happened? They could what? They could understand him. They could understand him. And that's a big, big deal, because you can go to other countries. Jim and I have been to the Philippines many times, but in a lot of those areas, guess what you need? A translator. And that's awkward to say the least. I teach a monthly class to people in India, and the last one just passed about a week ago, and I have to speak because we're cheap and Zoom only gives you 40 minutes. So if I speak a sentence and then it has to be translated into the language of the Indians that live in that province, then it's pretty it's a pretty big drain on our 40-minute hard time limit. So you can do that, but Paul could go, and no matter where he was, people could understand him. That ended up being an enormous deal for the gospel to be able to be spread. Another thing that the Greeks produced was the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, allowing study in a universal language. This was such a big deal that as we talk about it, as we go through it, the writers of the New Testament didn't use a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures. You know what they used? They used the one in Greek. They used the Septuagint. That's how important it was. Monumental. Number 3, the degenerate state of Greek mystery religions produced a desire to escape the evil world. There's always been, there always will be, people who look out at the world and say, surely we can do better. And then when the gospel came along into a very degenerate world, you had people who could offer one big word, and that one big word is hope, and turn people from what seemed like, as they looked out, what the same words that we would use, a cultural mess. The gospel could get them free from that. Okay, one more contribution, and that's the contribution of the Romans. The Pax Romana, or a time of peace, which allowed great freedom of movement. So Paul was able to go everywhere because of why? He didn't have to go through. He didn't have to go through what? He didn't have to go through war zones. He didn't have to go through war zones. Would I go to Ukraine? Yeah. It wouldn't be the funnest place to go. Why is that? Because of the war. Paul didn't have to worry about that because of the Pax Romana. And then along with that, the good system of Roman roads connecting the military posts in major cities. That just talks about the road because, of course, most of your traffic was via road. But also Paul could travel with very dependable what? Ships. You've got in Acts 27, and when I said very dependable, Acts 27, he actually what? He shipwrecked. What I meant by dependable is that every year they had this system, this schedule of their going back and forth through different parts of the world. Yes, some of them clearly ended in shipwreck, but that's what I mean. So dependable roads and dependable shipping traffic at least allowed for the planning of all of these different movements to spread the gospel. Then lastly, travel in the Roman army, which allowed new converts to preach the gospel at new posts. Paul, more than once, Paul would go, and who would he convert? He'd talk to soldiers. And as he talked to soldiers, what would they do? They'd go out and they would talk to and convert other people. So the point is, the fullness of times, while there is a definition to fullness, and we can find the definition of fullness, it doesn't even hold a candle to what you get when you actually peer down into what these three major groups, the Jews, the Greeks, and the Romans, did to form the world perfectly at that time. And that was the fullness of times, and that's the time that who chose to bring Christ into the world? That God chose to bring Christ into the world. Okay, when was Jesus born? Let's take a crack at this. We'll get a little more specific when we get to Matthew 2 and Luke 2, but we will just leave this at this point of their discussion right now. Josephus records that an eclipse of the moon just before Herod dies. Okay? Just before Herod died, there was an eclipse of the moon. Other known facts make it evident that he is referring to an eclipse on March the 13th, 4 BC. March the 13th, 4 BC. Secondly, Archelaus had just finished 7 days of mourning for Herod when he observed the Passover. Josephus tells us that the Passover occurred on April the 1st in the year 4 BC. So that gives us a point at which Herod had to have died. He had to have died between March the 13th and March the 24th of that year. Okay? This is where it gets strange. Dionysius produced a calendar in the 500s. So 500 years after Jesus lived. He made a mistake in calculating the year of Christ's birth. He made a mistake in calculating the year of Christ's birth. And actually, he missed it by several years, as we're going to see. So the so-called Christian calendar that is based on what? The birth of Christ. How do we know it's based on the birth of Christ? How do we know it's based on the birth of Christ? Okay, mainly, yes, the BC, but mainly the AD part. Do you know what AD means? Say it loud. What does AD mean? It does not mean BC, before Christ. AD does not mean what? After death. AD is short for a Latin expression, Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. Except he missed what is the actual year of the Lord. While we're at it, I might as well mention, there is no such thing as 0 AD. There is no such thing as 0 AD. There's 1 AD. If you ever talk about Jesus and the birth of Jesus in 0 AD, he wasn't born in 0 AD. He actually even wasn't even born in 1 AD. But 0 AD is a myth. It doesn't exist. It's either BC or it's AD. However, Jesus was not born in 1 AD. This is really, really hard to wrap your mind around. And when I first found out about this years and years and years ago, I just kept coming back to the fact that it can't be right. What's the ramification? So it's 2025. Should we really be using a calendar that would call it 2020? No, it's 2025. It's just the point at which that calendar started was actually a few years off. So, Herod killed the babies 2 years old and younger, so he could have been born as early as 6 BC. So, Christ could not have been born later than sometime around February the 4th BC. February 4 BC. I said February 4. February 4 BC. Jesus could not have been born later than February 4 BC. A mistake in our calendars that was made 1,500 years ago threw off that time period. So for whatever it's worth, and I've never jumped anyone's case, I've only explained it very simply. Usually, what year do we give as the beginning or the founding of the church? All of the old-time preachers used to say when? AD 33. That just simply can't be right. And it's probably more like 29. It could be 27. And again, if you want me to explain it with even more depth, it's really hard to, because it's really, really hard to come to grips with the fact that the years that we see, what they're based off of, was something that was incorrect. For whatever it's worth, and again, I've never gotten mean or hateful about it. The church was not started in AD 33. I mean, we know this. Herod had to have been alive. We know when he died. We don't know the day, but it's really, really in a tight time frame as to when he died. So Jesus could not have been born later than February 4 BC.